The weight of trajectories. A quiet morning. Each morning began the same way, with the silvered whisper of a pocket watch opening to reveal small, precise hands inching towards 6 o'clock. Wernher rose quietly, careful not to disturb Maria, his wife still breathing softly beside him. He dressed methodically, pulling on a clean, pressed shirt, fastening his suspenders, each step as exact as the calculations he carried daily in his mind. His fingers brushed gently against the slide rule resting on his desk, the wood polished smooth by years of use. The reassuring heft of the instrument felt familiar, simple, untainted by the shifting politics that had threaded through his life. Yet this morning, as he lifted the slide rule, something caught in the corner of his eye, a shadow cast from the window pane, elongated strangely in the pale dawn. The shape, distorted, seemed almost like a rocket poised mid-launch, trembling at the edge of flight. He hesitated, a chill feathering the back of his neck. It was nothing, merely a trick of the light, yet it lingered, unsettling his practiced calm. With a faint sigh, he tucked the slide rule into his breast pocket, its weight now more keenly felt than before. The telegram. The telegram arrived shortly before noon, delivered silently by a young corporal whose eyes avoided his. Wernher recognized the signs of bad news instantly. The corporal's stiff posture, the slight tremor in his hand as he placed the folded paper onto the polished desk. Wernher nodded curtly, dismissing him. Alone, he unfolded the telegram carefully, smoothing its thin surface, flat beneath the glare of the desk lamp. Berlin fallen. Prepare for immediate evacuation. Secure all documents. Await further orders. A sudden stillness filled the room. Pressing against his chest like a leaden weight, he stared at the words, feeling them ripple outward into his life, fracturing the careful equilibrium he'd maintained. Berlin fallen, the Reich collapsing, the war he'd never truly wanted, but had built rockets for nonetheless, had finally reached his doorstep. His fingers traced the edge of the telegram, feeling the roughness of its cut edge, the stark finality of its typed letters. The slide rule pressed heavy against his chest now, a silent reminder of choices made and roads taken. Echoes in the square. Wernher stepped from the laboratory into the gray afternoon haze, his briefcase tight in his grip, filled with rolled blueprints and meticulous notes he'd spent years refining. He walked through quiet streets, past boarded-up windows and abandoned cars, their tires long since stripped for rubber. Passing the central square, he saw the remnants of a propaganda poster, fluttering loosely, faded by weather and neglect, the once bold eagle and swastika peeling away like the skin of a rotting fruit. A small gathering stood silently in the plaza, faces gaunt and fearful. They watched him pass, eyes hollow yet accusatory, as though seeing in him the embodiment of their collective burden. He felt their stares, heavy and knowing. He quickened his pace, the briefcase pressing against his thigh as he moved toward his destination. Rumors whispered through streets and corridors of approaching American troops, of liberation or capture, judgment or salvation. He focused on the road ahead, his steps measured, heart beating steadily beneath an uncertain sky. The choice at dawn. In the dim hours before sunrise, Wernher stood alone in the sparse room where he'd decided his future. The lamp threw a weak circle of light against the tabletop, illuminating the folder before him, labeled simply, Top Secret. Inside lay his life's work, meticulous blueprints of the V-2 rocket, the machine that had brought both dreams and devastation. Outside, distant artillery rumbled softly, like thunder on the horizon, a subdued reminder of encroaching change. His hand hovered just above the folder, fingers trembling slightly. It would be simple, he thought, to burn the notes, scatter the ashes, vanish into anonymity. Yet the alternative whispered louder. His knowledge, his very survival could be bartered, exchanged for safety under a different flag. He had never cared deeply for politics, only for the elegance of numbers, the poetry of physics. Nonetheless, he could not escape the reality that his rockets had torn through skies, had brought ruin as well as wonder. Slowly, with a deep breath, he closed his fingers around the folder, feeling the weight of each carefully inscribed line. He would offer them to the Americans. Survival first, ideals later. In that quiet room, he made peace with the choice, though he knew the doubt would shadow him forever. Aftermath. Years later, in a clean, brightly lit office filled with new blueprints and sleek scale models, Wernher found himself often glancing back at the old slide rule on his desk. It seemed out of place now. Its wood, worn and faded, in stark contrast to the gleaming metal and plastic around him. Yet he kept it close, a quiet relic of paths traveled and choices made. He had traded uniforms, traded flags, built rockets that lifted humankind off Earth and carried them toward the moon. President Kennedy's voice echoed still, promising that America would reach for the stars, that they chose this journey not because it was easy, but precisely because it was hard. Yet beneath this stirring rhetoric, Wernher carried privately the echoes of the past, rockets that had fallen not on distant moons, but on crowded London streets, the shadowy weight of lives lost. In quiet moments, alone at his desk, he would touch the slide rule and remember the chill of that pre-dawn choice, the compromise he'd accepted to continue his work. He understood that history would judge him from afar, that his name would always carry the complexity of moral consequence, tangled in both achievement and guilt. But in these silent reflections, he felt the quiet assurance that he had survived, that his work had transcended borders and flags, even if he himself could never fully escape their weight. Footprints in dust. Decades later, a solitary visitor stepped into the abandoned grounds at Peenemünde. Moss had overtaken the concrete launch pads, ivy climbing rusted gantries. The visitor knelt slowly, fingertips tracing faint outlines etched into the weathered concrete, paths where V-2 rockets once stood proud and terrible. The wind whispered through empty corridors, carrying distant echoes of ambition and anguish, triumph and tragedy. Above, the sky stretched endlessly blue, unmarred by the contrails of war. Yet in the silence, the visitor felt the lingering presence of a man who had dreamed rockets into existence, who had chased the stars even as the earth burned below. Rising slowly, the visitor cast one last gaze over the silent ruins, understanding in some unspoken way the burden of choices made in darkness, carried quietly through the years like footprints pressed firmly into lunar dust.